Hello. The first hint that something was off came during our engagement party. I overheard Natalie on the phone in my home office, speaking in hushed tones. He doesn't suspect anything. No, trust me. Everything's going according to plan. When I confronted her, she laughed it off, saying she was planning a surprise honeymoon with her friend Rachel. I wanted to believe her so badly that I ignored the knot in my stomach. Then came the business trips. Natalie worked as a pharmaceutical sales rep, so frequent travel wasn't unusual. But the patterns started changing. She'd be gone for 3 days instead of 2, return with expensive gifts she claimed were from work conferences, and spend hours on her laptop late at night, always angling the screen away from me. When I'd wake up at 3 a.m., she'd be in the guest room, claiming our bedroom was too warm for her to sleep. The truth started unraveling during a dinner with Kevin and his wife Amanda. Amanda mentioned running into Natalie at the Four Seasons Hotel bar the previous Wednesday, when Natalie was supposedly in Chicago for work. The look of panic that flashed across Natalie's face before she composed herself and claimed Amanda must have confused her with someone else. That was the moment my world began to crack. I hired a private investigator the next day. Not because I wanted to be that guy, but because I needed to know the truth before investing my life savings in our upcoming wedding. The PI's first report came back within a week, and what I discovered made me physically ill. Natalie wasn't just having an affair. She was running an elaborate con with her ex-boyfriend Michael, targeting wealthy entrepreneurs across New England. They'd been working together for years, with Natalie playing the role of devoted partner, while systematically draining their victims' accounts before disappearing. The worst part? The wedding planning meetings she'd been having weren't with vendors. They were with their lawyer, preparing to transfer my business assets into a joint account the moment we said, "I do." The honeymoon surprise she'd mentioned at the engagement party? A one-way ticket to the Cayman Islands for her and Michael, using money from my own accounts. But Natalie had made one crucial mistake. She didn't know that before making my fortune in real estate, I'd spent 5 years working in corporate security. And she certainly didn't know about the fail-safes I'd put in place after my first business partner tried to embezzle from me years ago. As I sat in my office that night, reading the PI's report and looking at photos of Natalie and Michael together, I didn't feel the rage or devastation I expected. Instead, a cold, calculating clarity washed over me. They thought they were playing me? They had no idea what was coming. The next 2 weeks were the hardest performance of my life. Every morning, I'd kiss Natalie goodbye, pretending everything was normal while documenting every move she made. I learned to control my breathing when she'd touch me, fighting the urge to recoil from her hands that I now knew had been all over Michael just hours before. The same hands that had been systematically stealing from me, transferring small amounts to offshore accounts, thinking I wouldn't notice. My brother Kevin became my confidant and voice of reason during this time. "You need to be smart about this, James," he warned. "They've done this before. They're expecting an emotional reaction." He was right. The PI had uncovered 3 previous victims across Massachusetts and Connecticut. Each time, Natalie and Michael had walked away with millions, protected by ironclad prenuptial agreements and careful paper trails that made everything look legitimate. But their previous marks had been different. They'd chosen emotional targets, recently divorced men, widowers, guys so desperate for connection they ignored the red flags. I wasn't their usual prey, and that's where their plans started falling apart. While Natalie thought I was focused on our upcoming wedding, I was quietly moving pieces into position. First, I reached out to their previous victims. Thomas, a software entrepreneur from Hartford, had lost $2.3 million. Eric, a surgeon from Providence, had been taken for nearly $4 million. And Peter, a recently divorced CEO from Boston, had lost his company and his reputation. None of them had fought back, too embarrassed to admit they'd been conned. But I convinced them to share their stories, their documentation, their pain. Each piece added to the puzzle I was assembling. The turning point came when I discovered Natalie's burner phone in her gym bag. She'd gotten sloppy, too confident in her act. The messages between her and Michael were like a roadmap of their scheme. "James is such an idiot. Easier than the others. This time next month will be set for life." But the real gold was in their plans for the wedding. They'd invited their entire network of accomplices, planning to use my own celebration as a networking event for their next series of cons. I also found something that made my blood run cold: pictures of my teenage niece, Amanda's daughter, at her high school. They were planning to use her as leverage if I ever caught on to their scheme. That's when my plan for revenge shifted from professional to personal. This wasn't just about my money anymore. They'd threatened my family. Working with my security team, we set up surveillance on Michael. He wasn't the smooth operator Natalie had fallen for years ago. He was a desperate gambling addict who'd lost most of their previous scores at underground poker games. He was pushing Natalie to accelerate their timeline, demanding bigger transfers, taking increasingly stupid risks. Perfect. I arranged a meeting with him, posing as a potential investor in his fake tech startup. The look of panic on his face when I walked into that restaurant instead of the venture capitalist he was expecting, priceless. Here's how this is going to go, I told him, sliding an envelope across the table. Either you help me take her down, or I release everything I have on both of you to every law enforcement agency on the eastern seaboard. Michael folded like a cheap suit, exactly as I expected. Turns out, loyalty among thieves is a myth when one of them is staring at 20 years in federal prison. He gave me everything: account numbers, contacts, dates, the entire operation. But more importantly, he gave me the password to their shared cloud drive, where Natalie kept meticulous records of every con, every victim, every dollar. She documented everything, her own perfectionism becoming the evidence that would bury her. The hardest part wasn't gathering the evidence or coordinating with Michael. It was facing my own family. I had to tell them what was coming, especially Amanda, whose daughter had been unknowingly caught in Natalie's web. The night I showed them everything, I saw something break in my brother Kevin's eyes. He'd warned me about Natalie from the start, but even he hadn't imagined the depths of her deception. I should have protected you better, Kevin said, his voice rough with emotion. But I didn't need protection anymore. In a twisted way, Natalie's betrayal had forced me to confront my own patterns, my tendency to trust too quickly, to see what I wanted to see rather than what was actually there. The man sitting in my office that night wasn't the same optimistic fool who'd fallen for her act 3 years ago. The wedding preparations continued, with Natalie growing more confident by the day. She'd started slipping up, leaving obvious trails to offshore accounts, making rookie mistakes that would have alarmed me if I hadn't already known her game. What she didn't realize was that every transfer she made was being tracked. Every meeting she took was being recorded, and every single one of her accomplices was being identified and documented. One evening, about 2 weeks before the wedding, she tried to initiate sex. It had been happening less frequently over the past months, and now I knew why. She'd been saving her energy for Michael. As she pressed herself against me, I caught the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne. My stomach churned, but I played along, claiming a headache and an early meeting. The look of relief that flashed across her face was all the confirmation I needed. She'd just come from him. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I lay awake thinking about all the moments I'd missed, all the lies I'd believed, the mysterious work calls, the girls' nights that left no social media traces, the sudden interest in cryptocurrency that I now knew was just a way to move money undetected. Every memory was being rewritten, colored by the truth I now possessed. The next phase of my plan involved Rebecca, Michael's ex-wife from before he'd met Natalie. The PI had tracked her down in Seattle, where she'd rebuilt her life after Michael had cleaned out their accounts 6 years ago. She'd never gotten justice, had never even told her story publicly. When I reached out, she was initially reluctant to get involved. But after I showed her evidence that Natalie and Michael were planning to target other victims, she agreed to help. Rebecca's arrival in Boston was timed perfectly. She showed up at our favorite restaurant just as Natalie and I were finishing dinner. The color drained from Natalie's face as Rebecca approached our table, playing her role perfectly. "Oh my God! Michael's been looking everywhere for you," she gushed, pretending not to notice Natalie's discomfort. "He's been so worried since you left Seattle." Watching Natalie try to talk her way out of that one was like watching an Olympic-level performance in mental gymnastics. She claimed Rebecca must be confused, that she'd never been to Seattle, that she didn't know any Michael. But her hands were shaking as she reached for her wine glass, and I could see the calculations happening behind her eyes, trying to figure out how much I knew, how much Rebecca might reveal, how she could salvage her carefully constructed facade. That night, Natalie made 3 separate phone calls from the guest room, speaking in hushed, angry tones. I didn't need to hear the conversations to know she was scrambling, trying to figure out how Rebecca had found her, what it meant for their plans. Thanks to the surveillance equipment I'd installed, I heard every word of her panicked conversations with Michael, watching as their perfect plan began to show its first visible cracks. But this was just the opening act. The real performance was still to come, and I'd choreographed every move. As I listened to Natalie spin lie after lie to cover her tracks, I felt an almost serene calm. She thought she was the architect of this grand deception, but she'd never realized she was actually trapped in a maze of my design. And in 3 days at our engagement party, every exit would disappear at once. The morning of the engagement party, I woke up feeling strangely peaceful. Natalie was already gone, claiming she had last-minute details to arrange with the party planner. In reality, I knew she was meeting with Michael at their usual hotel, planning their exit strategy. Rebecca's appearance had rattled them more than I'd anticipated, forcing them to accelerate their timeline. My surveillance team had captured their entire conversation from the previous night. They were planning to empty my accounts immediately after the party, not waiting for the wedding as originally planned. I spent that morning with Kevin, finalizing every detail of what was to come. My brother had become more than just a confidant through this ordeal. He'd been my moral compass, keeping me from losing myself in the darkness of revenge. "Remember," he said, adjusting my tie in the mirror, "this isn't just about punishing them. It's about protecting others from going through what you did." He was right. In the weeks since discovering Natalie's true nature, I'd gone through every emotion imaginable: rage, despair, self-loathing, and finally, a kind of clarity I'd never experienced before. This wasn't just about my personal vendetta anymore. Through my investigation, I'd uncovered a network of similar operations across the country. Dozens of lives destroyed by people like Natalie and Michael. The engagement party was being held at the Boston Harbor Hotel, in the same ballroom where I'd first met Natalie 3 years ago. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. As guests began arriving, I watched her work the room with her usual charm, playing the role of the blushing bride-to-be perfectly. She'd chosen a stunning red dress for the occasion, though I now understood the symbolism wasn't about passion. It was about power. What she didn't know was that among the guests were 3 federal agents, Thomas and Eric, her previous victims, and a reporter from the Boston Globe who'd been building a story about romance scams targeting successful entrepreneurs. Every person in that room had been carefully chosen, each playing a part in the elaborate tableau I'd arranged. I caught glimpses of her throughout the evening, sending furtive texts when she thought no one was watching. Her composure was cracking around the edges. Rebecca's presence had thrown her more than she wanted to admit. When our eyes met across the room, she gave me that same loving smile she'd perfected over the years. But now I could see the calculation behind it, the slight tension in her jaw that betrayed her anxiety. The breaking point came during the toasts. Kevin stood up first, champagne glass in hand, and began telling the story of how Natalie and I met. But as he spoke, the details began to shift subtly, dates that didn't quite match up, inconsistencies in her backstory that she'd worked so hard to maintain. I watched her face as she realized what was happening, saw the moment she understood that her carefully constructed narrative was being dismantled in front of everyone she tried to impress. Then Rebecca stood up, ostensibly to offer her own congratulations. Instead, she began sharing her own story of her marriage to Michael, of the systematic fraud they'd perpetrated together, of how Natalie had entered their lives and helped orchestrate their biggest cons before partnering with Michael herself. With each word, I could see Natalie's world collapsing. Her hand was shaking so badly she set down her champagne glass, her eyes darting between the exits like a trapped animal. But the real coup de grace came from an unexpected source. Rachel, Natalie's supposed best friend and maid of honor, stepped forward. The same Rachel who'd allegedly been helping plan our surprise honeymoon. Except the real Rachel, I discovered, had died in a car accident 5 years ago. The woman who stood up wasn't Rachel at all. She was an FBI agent who'd been building a case against Natalie and Michael's network for the past year. As Rachel began detailing the extent of their criminal enterprise, complete with dates, bank records, and photographic evidence projected onto the ballroom screens, Natalie finally broke. She jumped up from her seat, but found her path blocked by hotel security at every exit. The look she gave me then, a mixture of fury, respect, and something close to fear, told me she finally understood. She wasn't the architect of this con. She never had been. For the first time in her life, Natalie found herself trapped in someone else's carefully laid plans, and the realization hit her like a physical blow. What followed was both less and more dramatic than I'd imagined during those long nights of planning. Natalie didn't scream or try to run. Instead, she did something that chilled me more than any outburst could have. She laughed. It was a hollow, broken sound that echoed through the suddenly silent ballroom, the kind of laugh that comes when someone finally realizes they've lost everything. "You really think you've won?" she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." But I did know. I knew exactly what I was dealing with because I'd become something she never expected, someone who could think like her, who could plan like her, who could be as ruthless as her, but with one crucial difference. I had truth on my side. The federal agents moved in smoothly, professionally. As they read Natalie her rights, I stepped forward and finally spoke the words I'd been rehearsing for weeks. "The money you transferred this morning? It's gone. Not just disappeared, gone. Every account you thought was secure has been frozen. Every contact you planned to run to has been compromised. Your entire network has been dismantled. And right now, similar scenes are playing out in Chicago, Seattle, and Miami." Michael was being arrested simultaneously at the hotel where he'd been waiting for Natalie's signal. Their lawyer, the one who'd been helping them set up the fraudulent accounts, had already turned state's evidence. The documentation I'd gathered had been enough to convince him to save himself rather than go down with them. The look in Natalie's eyes as she absorbed the full scope of what I'd done. It wasn't just anger or fear. It was recognition. For the first time, she was seeing me clearly, understanding that the man she dismissed as an easy mark had systematically dismantled every aspect of her life. The realization seemed to age her instantly, stripping away the polished facade to reveal the desperate con artist beneath. But my revenge wasn't just about their arrests. In the weeks leading up to this moment, I'd worked with the previous victims to set up a recovery fund for others who'd been targeted by similar schemes. The story breaking in tomorrow's Boston Globe wouldn't just expose Natalie and Michael. It would provide resources and support for other victims, turning their shame into strength, their isolation into community. As the agents led her away, Natalie turned back one last time. "I did love you, you know, in my own way." The words hung in the air between us, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the woman I thought I'd known. But that woman had never really existed. She'd been the most elaborate con of all. Kevin appeared at my side as the crowd began to disperse, placing a steady hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. The pain wasn't gone. I doubted it ever would be completely. But it had transformed into something else, something that felt almost like wisdom. "I will be," I answered honestly. For the first time in a long time, I actually believed that. The aftermath was messy, as these things always are. The investigation uncovered more victims than we'd initially thought, more lives damaged by their schemes. Natalie and Michael eventually pleaded guilty, facing significant prison time and restitution orders they'd never be able to fulfill. Their network of accomplices crumbled, each turning on the others in a desperate bid for leniency. A year later, I sat in my office, looking out over the harbor where this all began. A letter had arrived from Natalie's prison. I recognized her handwriting on the envelope. I held it for a long moment, feeling its weight in my hands, before feeding it unopened into the shredder. Some chapters don't need an epilogue. The experience changed me, there's no denying that. But not in the way Natalie and Michael might have intended. Instead of becoming bitter or untrusting, I'd learned to trust myself more, To recognize that sometimes the greatest act of self-respect is refusing to engage with those who've betrayed you, even when they offer explanations or apologies. Thomas, Eric, and Peter had become unlikely friends through all of this. We met monthly, not to dwell on our shared past, but to work on preventing others from falling victim to similar schemes. The recovery fund had already helped dozens of people rebuild their lives, turning our collective pain into something meaningful. The engagement ring that I'd chosen with such hope now sat in a safe, a reminder not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd gained: clarity, strength, and a deeper understanding of both human nature and my own resilience. Some might call what I did revenge, but I prefer to think of it as justice, not just for me, but for everyone who'd ever been manipulated by people like Natalie and Michael. Thank you for listening the story to the end. Write your thoughts about it in the comments and do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next videos. Bye.